Welcome back. This is Dr. Kurt Sander with Music Theory Simplified. Today's topic is about the basics of what we call part writing. Now, in music theory, when you've studied all the fundamentals and you know how to build triads and identify intervals and build seventh chords, the remainder of one's time is spent in one of two different areas, either in analysis or with part writing. Now, analysis is simply looking at someone else's music to figure out what is going on harmonically, melodically, how it's put together. But with part writing, the student is actually creating his or her own four-part model of harmonic progression. Now, this is not simply writing chords, but rather thinking of these voices that make up a chord as independent melodic ideas. So unlike a guitar strumming a chord, you don't hear individual melodic lines necessarily in that kind of context. So what we're looking to do is to create music from a linear standpoint. That means the alto has its certain melodic line, the soprano has its certain melodic line, and all of these come together to create this thing that we call harmonic progression that is represented in a four-part model. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. In today's lesson, I'm going to give you 10 rules for basic part writing. Now, the word rule has a kind of negative connotation. Seems like it's something that's very dogmatic. And it's true that many composers have broken these rules for various reasons over time. So instead of the word rule, we might think of these as stylistic norms. For example, a composer A and composer B might have completely different musical styles, but both of them working within this thing that we call tonal harmony, both of them are applying these stylistic norms in their writing. So who invented these rules? Where did they come from?
No one person can take credit for this. In fact, the rules for part writing, as we call them, were really the products of centuries of evolution that extend all the way back to the very beginning of what we call polyphony. The word polyphony simply means that more than one voice or instrument is playing or singing at the same time. It's hard to believe that in the history of Western music, the very first written examples of polyphony do not appear until the turn of the 10th century. Over the next hundreds of years, this practice of adding voices and combining voices became something that was more accepted. And in time, composers, particularly those in the Renaissance, began to develop methods for how to combine different melodic ideas. Now, they didn't think of chords the way we do today. Rather, they thought of intervallic relationships, consonance and dissonance, and the fluctuation of unstable and stable sounds. This really laid the foundation for current harmonic theory.
Unfortunately, we have very little time with this lesson. We can't get into all of the rules of counterpoint, but it's a fascinating area of study, and many college curricula talk about species counterpoint before they talk about four-part harmonic writing. But many of the rules that we would learn in counterpoint do apply to four-voice writing as well. So let's begin by talking about the four-part vocal model that we will use for our part writing examples. And we call this model a chorale.
The chorale is a genre attributed to the 16th century reformer Martin Luther. Essentially, a chorale takes a very singable hymn tune and harmonizes it for four voices. The chorale is the precursor of the modern-day hymn. But our interest in the chorale is not necessarily historical, but pedagogical. It creates a great tool for us to study voice leading. It enables us to work with three-voice triads, as well as four-voice seventh chords.
So let's talk about the basics of the chorale format and see how we can go about using this model as a means of understanding harmonic progression.
When writing in chorale style, we have to envision an imaginary choir of soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. When we put the notes on the page, the soprano stem always goes up, the alto always down, and the tenor always up, and the bass stem always down. This never changes.
Now that you know how to put notes on a page, let's go through one at a time the 10 basic rules for good part writing. And we begin with rule number 1.
When writing for a choir, you need to be aware of the ranges of your singers. Now, this depends on the level of the choir, but for part writing purposes, our ranges are as follows: C to G for soprano, G to D for alto, C to G for tenor, and in the bass section, E to E. Obviously, writing notes out of this range can cause problems. In this first chord, we see that the soprano is too high, and in the second, the bass note is too low. Part writing rule number 2. Avoid voice crossing. In general, when we write in 4-part chorale style, we want to keep each voice in its own zone, so to speak. In the example shown here, you can see that this is voice crossing because the bass is going above the tenor voice. Sometimes it's hard to see this, though. For example, here, the tenor F is actually above the alto D. This is still considered voice crossing. It's perfectly acceptable, however, for voices to share a single pitch, like this tenor and bass G. This is actually not that uncommon. Rule number 3. No more than an octave between upper voices. In 4-part chorale style writing, when voices are too far apart from each other, we tend not to hear them as related. Therefore, it's always important to keep less than an octave between the soprano and the alto, and between the alto and the tenor. However, between the tenor and the bass, because these are lower voices, that acoustical problem is not so apparent. So it's perfectly acceptable to find more than an octave between the tenor and the bass. Let's take a look at an example of 3 potential spacing problems. Here in letter A, there's more than an octave between the tenor G and the alto B. It's a bit hard to detect because it crosses the staff, but these do occur. In letter B, it's slightly clearer. Here in letter C, there is more than an octave between the low G bass and the B tenor, but because these are the lowest voices, this is considered okay. Rule number 4. Avoid voice overlap. Voice overlap is different from voice crossing because it requires us to think about 2 chords next to each other. Here we have 2 voices, an upper voice and a lower voice. Voice overlap says that the lower voice cannot go beyond where the upper voice was in the previous chord. Likewise, the upper voice cannot extend lower than where the lower voice was in the previous chord. Let's look at an example of voice overlap. Here you can see that the alto has extended beyond the G that the soprano had in the previous chord. This would be considered objectionable. Let's look at one other example of voice overlap. Here you can see that the tenor went below where the bass was in the previous chord. This is also considered objectionable. It's important to remember that this rule only applies to chords that are next to each other. Here you can see the alto is on a G that the soprano once had. That's perfectly fine because it didn't cross beyond that. It's also fine even though there was a soprano F sharp earlier in the progression. Part writing rule number 5. No parallel fifths or octaves. This is the rule that many students remember from theory class. When voices move in perfect intervals, that is the octave or the fifth specifically, they lose a sense of independence. It's almost as if they sound like one voice. For this reason, we have a very specific rule in music theory that voices should not move in parallel motion by octave or by fifth. Spotting parallel octaves and fifths in your writing is not that easy, but let's give it a try. This next example, push pause until you have found the parallel octaves, then push play. Did you find them between the soprano and the bass, both moving from C to D? Now let's try it with fifths. Push pause until you have found the parallel fifths. There they are, D to A, C to G, between the bass and the alto.
Well, I hope you were able to spot those parallel octaves and parallel fifths. It's kind of tough, especially when they're in different staves, but with practice it does get easier over time. There's one thing that I do want to mention about parallel fifths, however, and it has to do with a certain kind of fifth that we call an unequal fifth. Let me show you what I mean.
In music theory, looks can be deceiving. For example, when we look at this interval going to this interval, it looks like parallel fifths. They're both fifths and they both move in the same direction. However, when we actually look at the first interval, B to F, we know that that's actually a diminished fifth, not a perfect fifth. And when diminished fifths move to perfect fifths, we call these unequal fifths, and they are considered acceptable.
Well, we're halfway through our list of 10 part writing rules. At the end of this video, I'll list these rules again and you can write them down. And it's good to have that in a piece of paper when you're doing your part writing so that you can check your work. Well, let's keep moving on. Rule number 6.
Part writing rule 6. Avoid contrary fifths and octaves. Contrary fifths and octaves are similar to parallel fifths and octaves, but the voices move in opposite directions. Here we can see that we have an octave moving to an octave in the outer voices. This is considered objectionable, just as if it were moving in the same direction. The same principle applies to the interval of the fifth. Here, between the tenor and bass, we have a fifth that moves in contrary motion to another fifth. Like the octave, this is also objectionable. Part writing rule 7. Avoid direct fifths and octaves. Direct fifths and octaves occur in outer voices. Here we can see the soprano and bass both moving to an octave, but there's a leap in the soprano. This is considered a direct octave, and it's considered also objectionable. The same applies to fifths. When both outer voices move in the same direction to the interval of a fifth, and there's a leap in the soprano, we call this a direct fifth. While it's not considered as bad as a parallel fifth, they're still problematic. Part writing rule number 8. Avoid writing melodic, augmented, or diminished intervals. This is especially a problem when you're writing for the voice. You'll notice here in the soprano, we have the leap of an augmented fourth. That's considered problematic because, frankly, it just doesn't sound that good, and it's tough to sing. Here's another example of an augmented interval. The soprano sings from the B flat to the C sharp, creating an augmented second. That's problematic as well. This normally occurs between the 6th and 7th scale degrees of minor. Part writing rule number 9. Raise the leading tone in minor on the 5 and 7 chords. This is the easiest rule to understand, but the hardest to remember. If you recall from earlier lectures, we had 3 forms of minor scale. The one we used most often in harmony is the harmonic minor scale, which required us to raise the leading tone, or the 7th scale degree. So when we add harmony to this melodic line, we need to do the same thing with our chords. Raise the leading tone in the 5 chord, and on the 7 chord. Since it's not in the key signature, we'll actually have to add the accidentals ourselves. This seems to be one of those things that students always forget. Please note that you don't need to raise the leading tone on the 3 chord because it does not have a dominant function.
Well, we've come down to our last rule, rule number 10, which really is not about writing notes. It's about how you write the notes. And it starts with one of these.
Rule number 10. Use a pencil. There are 10 rules that you've learned, but chances are you'll break a lot of them when you first start part writing, and you'll go through a lot of these. So make sure you use a pencil so that you can erase. And you wouldn't be alone. Here's Mozart's original score. And here's a score by Beethoven. And here's one by Bach. Okay, Bach was perfect, but we're not, so make sure you use a pencil.
Well, there you have them. 10 rules for good part writing. Easy, right? Well, actually, it's not that easy. In fact, it will take you a long time before these rules become solidified. Only through repeated practice and error detection will you truly see how these are applied in 4-part choral writing. But before we go, as promised, let's run through these 10 rules again. And as I said, write them down on a piece of paper so you won't forget and you can check your work when you're done.